All right. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to our panel on open data policies, focused on accomplishing mission objectives through open data. We've got a great panel here, and I have my notes on my phone. So if you excuse me, I'll...
Hello?
Please stand by.
What was that?
I'll wait for the thumbs up from the back. All right. Is this mine?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
my new toy.
That's a good idea.
It's like my lawnmower this week. It died halfway through my front lawn, and I was wondering what could this possibly be? And then I looked at it and I was like,
Gas.
but it just started to sputter, like shh, 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 and then just shh.
All right. All right, hello again. Okay, we're back. Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. You remember what I said before? I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. I'm really happy with this panel. We've got folks from, everyone's from sort of a different sector or an industry that uses open data. So first I'm going to go from the end here. We've got Debbie Brote-Giles. She's the Digital Assets Manager at the National Renewable Energy Lab. You're in Boulder, right?
Golden.
Golden, okay, sorry, Golden, Colorado. I hope I didn't offend you.
No.
I don't know if there's like a Golden Boulder rivalry.
It's very close.
Okay. And then next there is Aaron Wasserman, who's Legislative Director in Derek Kilmer's office, Representative Derek Kilmer's office. And then Rebecca Williams, who's a Senior Analyst at the Johns Hopkins Center for Government Excellence. And then next to me is Joel Goran, who's the President of the Open Data Enterprise, which is a local nonprofit that focuses on open data issues and policy. And so before we begin the panel, we've got a bunch of questions lined up, and we also want to open it up for you for questions. But I wanted to give everyone a few minutes to talk about their work and how it's related to open data. So we'll just go in the order that I introduce everybody. So
Okay.
over to you, Debbie.
Hello, everyone. I'm Debbie Brote-Giles. I'm with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. Very close to Boulder, though. So it's a national lab that's part of the DOE National Lab Complex, and we do renewable energy research. So there's, as you can imagine, a lot of data that comes out of that research. So we have open data, we have closed data, we have a wealth of data for our scientists, and then also data that we need to get out to the industry. Those industry folks need it for a bunch of scientific work, and then also we're really focused on getting data out to entrepreneurs as well, because the entrepreneurs nowadays need data as well to build businesses. And DOE is really focused on trying to build businesses in the renewable energy industry. So we have been using AWS for 7 years now. So it's been a long time, and for a national lab, I think we were kind of leading the charge way back then. We had several open data platforms where we were kind of building crowdsource data sets, and we were trying to collaborate with industry participants. And so really utilizing our in-house servers was problematic. So we turned to AWS because it's agile and scalable and helping us to be more collaborative. And so it's been really successful, and we've grown and changed over time. And now we have more than 30 applications on AWS. And then the other great thing about our growth, I think, over time is that we've also helped educate internally our staff, because in the beginning, people were like, they knew that the cloud sounded good, and they actually even paid to go there because we didn't have a funding model in the beginning to get people out there on the cloud. So projects individually would choose to come on the cloud, and we would charge them independently. And now we have executive management buy-in that is great, and so now they're treating the cloud servers just like they do on the internal side. So that's been very helpful for us.
Thank you.
Is that good?
Yeah, that's great, thanks. So Aaron?
Yep. Hi, my name is Aaron Wasserman. I'm Representative Derek Kilmer's Legislative Director. Derek Kilmer is from Washington State. He represents the Olympic Peninsula, so Tacoma up north. Before joining Congress, he worked for a consulting firm's tech sector, and he got to travel all over California and work with companies on their ability to use technology effectively. After that, he worked in economic development for 10 years and was simultaneously a member of the State House and State Senate, and then came out here to work for Congress. And so one of the things we like to do in our office is introduce ourselves by saying, "Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm with the federal government, more specifically Congress, and we're here to help." And most people always laugh and say, "No, you're not. Go away. Please don't help. In fact, just sit down and do nothing." But Congress is really good about doing nothing. Unfortunately, our office is not. You know, my boss really does think about, how do we actually make government work a little bit better, and how do we use technology to actually accomplish that? So, we always think about problems. We think about, specifically with data, the government doesn't look at data uniformly as an asset. We look at it as a liability and a security risk. And if your number one goal is to stay away from the Washington Post front page, chances are you're going to hold on to your data and not share it and hope that nobody else finds a way to get to it. Unfortunately, that's not really helpful. That's not what the government's for. We're here to provide service. We're here to save taxpayer money. And quite honestly, in our impression, it's our job to help the private sector create jobs and innovate. And that's what really got us interested in making data available and usable for the public, but then also available and usable for the federal government. Agencies should not have to pay for the data that other agencies have already paid for and collected. And that's a problem. And if you look at the Census Bureau, for instance, a great organization that has an excellent track record of protecting individuals and company information, they're paying for data that the IRS has. And they're wasting millions of dollars doing it. And there's no reason for that at all. In fact, they're not paying for it, we are. And that's really challenging. So what's the solution to that? My boss, really believes that if you're going to do anything, you might as well do it right. And so for the last year and a half, he's been working on a bicameral and bipartisan bill to try and overcome these challenges. And so the Open Government Data Act, if any of you like going to congress.gov, HR 5051, it's a great 31 pages. Does a lot of really good things. One, it makes data available in an open format by default. It requires agencies to work with their data with regard to their decision making. It requires all data assets be publicly listed on an enterprise data inventory unless there's a reason for them not to be. It requires data to be in the enterprise data inventory to be made available on data.gov, which is a great first step, but not quite as good as it could be or usable. It empowers CIOs to actually be change agents and advocates for the use of data and to ensure that individuals who need the information that they need to actually get it, to invest in whether it's cloud services to make it available, whether it's applications or what have you. And then also, it drives program managers to look at their capability to analyze. So once you have data, how are you actually going to use it? And so this legislation actually requires agencies to look themselves in the mirror and say, okay, I have it, I've got to use it, how am I going to use it, and how well am I using it? And so it creates this iterative process of OMB and GAO playing whack-a-mole with agencies, more or less saying, you're doing a good job, but you could do better. Keep going. So we're really encouraged by this bill. It was just recently marked up by the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, and we're hoping that the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee will mark it up and move it forward. We've got 50 organizations comprised of think tanks, advocacy organizations, private sector businesses, and government entities who have all collaborated and supported this legislation. And I think really because it gets to a nonpartisan and basic truth, and that is if we've paid for it, we might as well use it. And if the government can do anything, supporting the private sector and job creation would be a good place to start. So, thank you.
Rebecca?
My turn. Okay. So my name's Rebecca Williams. My background, I did a joint law and city planning degree, and then I was working as a city planner in New York City for a nonprofit regional planning. It's like the oldest city planning group in the country, and I was using city data all the time, and it was when New York City passed their open data law. And I was like pretty hooked on the idea. Like I was a user, I needed more data, and New York City was sort of moving forward with that. And then from there, this is, I don't know how many years ago, 4 years ago? I've been in the open data space in many different roles since then. So I've worked at the Sunlight Foundation advocating for open data policies at the local level, like around the country. There are 65 local open data policies right now in cities, counties, and states around the country. After that, I started working in the federal space, so I worked at data.gov implementing the OMB federal policy that my previous nonprofit had helped advocate for. So I had like the role of having to actually make work what we wanted to have happen work, which turned out to be very difficult. So I gained a lot of perspective with that. And then from there, from data.gov, was at OMB for a bit, so like more of a federal bad cop role, saying like agencies, you're not doing as good as you should be doing, and here's why. And now, currently, I'm with the Center for Government Excellence is the longer term, we affectionately call it GovX at Johns Hopkins. It's a Bloomberg funded entity that's working on the What Works Cities initiative. It's similar to what I was doing with Sunlight previously, where I go city to city. I'm going to Albuquerque tomorrow. I was in Chula Vista last week. Week before that, I was in Nashville. Like I go city to city and I talk to local governments about how they're using their data. And it's interesting and sometimes depressing and sometimes exciting that the problems are the same no matter the scale, including cloud services. But for this panel about policies, like I have the benefit, I think, of being like one of like 5 people in the world that have like read all the open data policies. I was just catching up on the 2016 ones, and I don't think they're very good. And I'm happy to talk about that later. But in terms of like, I very much think that open data policy in government is the modern version of the Freedom of Information Act and that advocacy that happened back then. And like I've been a big believer in structured access to public records. Before you had to go get the filing cabinet and photocopy it, but a lot has changed since then. And that access is incredibly important. And I'm the Johnny Appleseed of like bringing it around. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Joel?
Great. I'm Joel Goran. I'm president and founder of the Center for Open Data Enterprise here in DC. We are one of the 50 organizations that has signed on to your legislation, and I have not read all the open data policies, so I want to learn about what they all say. But I've read some of them, and I work with people who've read them very carefully. So what we do is we're about, our mission is to maximize the value of open government data as a public resource. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into this and how our team started working together. So my background's a combination of nonprofit and journalism. I was the former editorial director for Consumer Reports, and from there joined the FCC about 6 years ago as head of the Consumer Bureau, and that's really when I started looking at open government data. Our chairman, when he told me what he really wanted the Consumer Bureau to do, the only thing he really wanted was to develop an algorithm that would help people figure out what cell phone plan to buy. This turns out to be virtually mathematically impossible, so we never quite got there. But in the course of trying to take on this impossible task, I talked to a lot of people at other agencies who are working on similar problems, and ended up being invited to co-chair a White House task force on smart disclosure, which is essentially what we called open data for consumer use. So from there, I got really interested in government data. I wrote a book called Open Data Now. I went to work with the GovLab at NYU, which looks at open data among other kinds of good government things that they work on. And that's where the team that is now our center began to work together. So we began by doing a project called the Open Data 500, which I think was really the first major project to look at all the different ways that, that open data can be used by business and by the private sector. We had heard from someone in the administration that someone had promised the president that by the end of 2013 they would have 500 examples of open data being put to use, because that was the year that the open data policy was enacted. And we were foolish enough to say we could probably figure out how to do that. So the Open Data 500 came out, was fully launched in 2014, and what we saw is it enabled us to actually map how different companies in the US were using different kinds of open data from different federal agencies. At the same time as we were doing our research on this, and the we here was a team of 4 of us, including Laura Manley, Catherine Garcia, Audrey Aris. We are the 4 who are have now come down here and launched the Center for Open Data Enterprise. What we found is that the people in these businesses, particularly smaller businesses, did not know who to go to in government to get better data, and the people in the agencies had no idea who was using their data. So it was like this. So we decided to launch a series of open data roundtables, initially at the GovLab, and now we run them through the center here with AWS, one of our core sponsors, which really was tremendously helpful in getting us off the ground and getting us going. We began with Department of Commerce, then USDA, and eventually did roundtables with 8 different federal agencies, where the basic idea was you get together in a room, people who provide the data, people who use the data, and we like to think of this as it's kind of a low-tech approach to a high-tech problem. You know, you can actually develop ways to have structured dialogues that begin to get at what the issues are, what the priorities should be, and how you can actually improve this open data ecosystem by getting users and providers working together. So from that, we moved down to DC because we were doing more and more work with the feds and also increasingly with the World Bank. We do a lot of international work as well. And this past couple of months, we've now been partnering with the White House to lead a series of cross-agency roundtables. So once we did the initial ones agency by agency, we kept seeing a lot of the same problems coming up over and over again. So we've now done 4 roundtables on data quality, privacy, public-private partnerships, and also research data and ways of managing research data in a more open kind of way than has been done in the past. And we now have the task of trying to pull all of this information together. We're hoping that this supports the development of open data guidelines by the White House, and we're also going to be putting our own report together as well. If you're interested, our website is opendataenterprise.org or odenterprise.org. If you go to the Convene tab, you'll see all about these roundtables we're doing, and there's a lot there about our international work as well. But our interest is very much in seeing how we can work with policymakers and how we can work with data users to try to bridge those gaps, and also to sort of help prioritize policy and federal open data on the basis of user needs. So we hope we can make a contribution there.
Thank you, Joel. And I'm realizing I failed to introduce myself and why AWS has an open data panel at its event. So my name's Jed Son, and I run the open data program at AWS. And so the reason we care about open data is because we have customers like Debbie who are, it's their mission to share data with the world, and we want to help them understand how to use the cloud to do it. We also have lots of commercial sector customers, so customers like Esri or the Climate Corporation, just 2 examples off the top of my head, that they rely on access to publicly available data to build their products and build their services. And so we have customers on both sides of the table, just as Joel's described, that need open data. And so we want to make sure that they both know that the cloud is a very effective and useful way to share data and to consume it, which is why we supported Joel's work. It's also why we supported the Open Government Data Act. One thing that we said when we were supporting the Open Government Data Act and explaining our support for it is that more open data in the world is kind of like more oxygen in the atmosphere for our ecosystem. If there's more data out there that's useful to people, it gives people more excuses to build systems and applications on AWS. And so that's why we're here and why we care so much about this. So one thing that I'm really interested in finding out from Aaron, first off, is if you could tell us a little bit about where did the Open Government Data Act come from? We've seen a lot of open data policies over the past few years. What was the beginning of this one, and how did you all get involved?
Yeah, no, it was, this actually happened the way that it should happen. We had a constituent come to us and say, I don't think the government's really smart with the actions that it takes. I don't think it's really informed. I really think that it should use data. And so we started to peel back from that. We started to talk with a lot of folks, and we started to see that in 2013, the administration made a really good step, and they had issued their open data policy. And I started asking questions, and I'm like, so how do you actually do that? And a lot of agencies started going, well, we're not. And my boss is on the appropriations committee, so then the next thing, there's a really thick book that comes with each agency budget, their justification, and behind that's an even thicker book that says this is actually how we spent your money the year before. And you go through that and you say, oh, how much money have you spent trying to implement the open data policy? And they're like, well, we're not. And so, we started to peel back the onion. We say, well, what's the rationale for this? And so some folks think that OMB can't force them to. Some folks think that it's not in their best interest. Some folks look at the statute and say data is not even defined here. You can't tell me what to do. And so we started to think, with all of those problems and the fact that President Obama is not going to be here in a year, how do we keep this alive and how do we actually propel it forward? And so the easiest thing for us to do is to take the open data executive order, try and codify as much of that as we can, and then also try and push agencies to be forward-leaning with how they use data, and really to open the door for the private sector and advocates and other interests to come in and say, I want that data, hey, you should collect this data, or it's not working, please help me.
Right. That's good, thank you. And I'm reminded, I failed to mention one thing that I should have mentioned, is that last week we announced a collaboration between AWS and the IRS to make their 990 filings data. So 990 is the form the IRS uses to, thank you, to gather, it's basically the tax returns from not-for-profits. And they've been gathering that electronically. They've had it in machine-readable format themselves, but they've never made it available in a machine-readable format. And so we're working with them to do basically precisely what the Open Government Data Act prescribes, which is make the data available in a machine-readable format. It's just been a week since we announced it. I mean, less than a week. We're already seeing projects on GitHub crop up that are making use of the data, which is exactly what we want to see. So anyway, thank you, Aaron. Hopefully this is just a taste of things to come. Now, Debbie, I've got a question for you, which is so you've been doing this stuff for a long time. You've been sharing data with the scientific community. Have open data policies impacted what you do? Have they forced you to do this, or is it more mission-driven?
Yeah, we started because of the policies, for sure. We kept going to our researchers and saying, you really actually have to share this data. There are policies out there that say you need to. And like you said, there are some of those researchers that kind of were resistant. They were like, well, wait, I don't want to share my data yet because I want to publish on it. So it's definitely an education thing and a culture shift actually at the lab. But I do think that as time goes on, it's becoming more and more of a mission-driven need, and people are starting to see the value in it, because there's been a couple instances where now that we've shared the data, now we actually know that the data existed. Many, many, many times there was data sets that were very valuable, but they were on a researcher's desktop at their desk, and maybe he retired, and then that data set really literally vanished. And so now that we're opening up these data sets, we're getting lessons where, oh, we see that the data sets are there, we now are cataloging them and giving people access to them, and people are now building off of them. So instead of just having it and hiding it and not wanting to share it, now people are opening up and they want to share it almost proudly, like they would have a number of publications that they're going for. Hopefully I want to shift it so the more data sets that you share, that could be a feather in your cap as well. So I think that it's slowly changing, but it definitely is a culture shift, I think.
Right. And you hinted at the fact that they want to publish against the data, so there's sort of an incentive structure change that needs to happen as well.
Right.
And so now, Rebecca, you've hinted at the provocative comment that data policies, that having read all of the policies, there's perhaps a decline in quality. What has you concerned?
Well, I want them to be getting stronger, not weaker.
Right.
And a lot of open data policies, so like in terms of like the taxonomy of open data policies, like at the local level, we have executive orders, we have laws, we have sort of just internal administrative memos, and to the point about codifying an executive order, the best is the law because that lasts into a next administration, and we're seeing less of those. And then they've just like sort of, a lot of them have said open by default, but not really had any sort of like consequences or follow-up for that. And I feel like some of the language is getting watered down a bit. One highlight though, which we'll see how it actually pans out, was New York, which I mentioned, which is like one of the leaders in open data to begin with, passed several laws late fall last year that had to do with oversight. So having offices actually go through to an agency and like see, did you actually provide the full inventory or not? I think at one point it was like a specific oversight office, and now it's the mayor's office, which is like a little bit weaker. But like, what's the accountability mechanism to know that you're actually listing everything? So the enterprise data inventory was mentioned. This is already part of the federal open data policy as written by OMB. The idea behind that is you're listing all of your data, your non-public, your restricted public, and your public data. And this is actually used like post OPM hack as like a guiding list of like what do we have to make sure is like super secure. So again, it's managing information as an asset. It's not just straight up open data. And making sure that those lists exist and that there's some accountability to make sure that those lists are correct is really important to like getting to that end product where we're sharing everything or securing everything that we need to secure.
It's really interesting. So there are a couple things in there that I want to sort of dig in on a little bit, which was the idea that it's not just opening data. It's quite a bit more nuanced now. It's managing data as an asset. And so how would you care? Like, so if is there going to be a name change for the movement? You know, from open data. I mean, I've actually started saying shared data more frequently in terms of what I do.
Well. Yeah, I get, there's also like open washing is the term, where people say it's open, but it's not open. I think open data is still like a really clear concept, and like the hashtag shall remain. But certainly like, so in terms of like federal level versus local level and how they've sort of implemented these policies, we've had some local governments get a lot closer to that like full inventory and like next steps. And a lot of the policies to date have really focused on dissemination and not the entire process. But I think like a lot of the next steps too are going to involve like data governance and like really specific things. So like FITARA was a federal law that was passed last year, giving CIOs more power at like the table. I think as as the world becomes more digital, we're going to have to sort of embed digital principles all throughout. Like every role in government is going to have some sort of digital aspect to it, but certainly managing our information is going to have to be taken a lot more seriously than it has been.
And along those lines, I'd say that data provenance and data licensing are going to be really important to keeping that going.
Yeah, so the good thing about the feds, in theory, is all government works are not copyrightable, and then also like is data copyrightable. But this is like totally different when it gets into any sort of like contractor or granted option, and we've seen some of those grant policies, but also at the local level is completely different. There's a great resource that Harvard put out last year going through the government work status of each state, which is like different. So in my role, like dealing with local municipalities, I basically have to be like, let's look at the state law and like precedent and like how government works have been treated, because I can't take it for granted that because a government employee created this data set that it'll automatically be public domain or some sort of like CC0 open license. They have an option. And in fact, it's like a very common practice at all levels of government, but especially local levels of government, to sell GIS info in return. Like it's just like what they do. So sort of in terms of culture change, it's like, no, you don't actually need that $2,000 from your maps.
Right.
We can get it elsewhere, and this is like what you need to do. But it's certainly been like common practice, so it's like changing some of those practices.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things that we're finding in our work is that often the roadblocks are really not technical, and particularly with AWS and others, coming in from the private sector to help, the technical hurdles are getting lower and lower. But that the hurdles tend to be cultural, legal, or some combination. So we did an interagency roundtable on privacy, and the main thing that emerged was not we need better anonymization technology because there seems to be a general feeling that you're never going to get to 100%, but more like we need some combination of better data governance and better strategies about how do you balance the public need to know about things like home mortgage practices, which CFPB is dealing with, versus the low but not zero risk of some kind of identity breach. We had one on research data, and the first thing that everybody talked about was incentives, right? So it wasn't what's the best platform, or it wasn't, how do you technically share this data? It's how do you get a researcher to feel okay about letting their data out there before they have milked it for anything they could possibly publish from it. And people talk about things like setting up incentives for, as you were just saying, for publishing your data set. What if we had a citation system where the number of times your data set gets cited is as important and valuable for your career as the number of times your published paper gets cited? So we keep coming back again and again to these almost kind of soft problems in a sense, because they're not technical problems, and yet in another way they're very difficult problems. But they get us focused on issues like governance, issues like data provenance, issues like licensing, issues like incentives, which may be where a lot of these solutions have to come from.
And Joel, I was going to ask, based on all the roundtables you've done recently, based on what you just said, where do you feel like the next policies are going to come from? So a lot of what you're describing, those incentive structures come from, grantors, like NIH or NSF.
Yeah.
Does Congress still have more work to do, or can this kind of stuff be solved by other entities?
Well, I think these guys are onto something.
Right.
That could be really, really important and really significant.
Congress has more work to do.
Yeah.
Congress does have more work to do. Absolutely.
Sorry, Aaron.
No, but I think we see everything through the lens of the user community, but I actually do think that that's where a lot of the solutions are going to come from. And I would say if there's one really under-leveraged resource in all of this, it probably is the kind of user feedback, what's possible to get through really effective feedback mechanisms from users, not just a button on the website that says, if you want to complain, click here and thank you for complaining, but some systems that were being set up now, one that's come out of HHS, an approach called demand-driven open data, which is a really, kind of developed methodology for getting input from users that then results in improvement of data sets and improvement of the system. And I think the other piece is that users are going to be extraordinarily important in prioritization. The Open Data the Open Data Policy essentially says, go forth and make all your data, timely and accurate and machine readable and, just really, really great data. You can't do that overnight. It can't possibly be done overnight. It could be done maybe increasingly on a going forward basis, but we're also seeing a lot of people say that there's a value in historical data as well. So what users can help do is they can help agencies prioritize and help agencies sort of say, what's the 10% of my data sets that are likely to have 90% of the public value, and how do I begin to work on those and show results that are also going to keep the momentum going? I think the one other, then I'll stop, but I think the one other reason user involvement is so important, we are now working with the White House. We hear a lot of people in the administration very, very concerned about the transition to the next administration. Whatever party it is, there's no guarantee that there's going to be the same kind of commitment that the Obama administration has really had to open data. And getting the user community really engaged, I think, is going to be very important in keeping the momentum going and keeping the pressure on to continue making these kinds of improvements.
Thank you.
I think
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead,
in terms
Rebecca.
of where the policies are going to, in addition to sort of codifying the general ones and strengthening these general ones, there's more specific policies that are going to happen. So like Data Act style. So
Right.
Congress passed the Federal Transparency Spending Act called the Data Act, but this has happened locally too. There's also been before any of these open data laws, there was a big push for first GIS portals at the state level, and then open checkbooks. So it was like maps, money, and there's specific, local legislation that says you have to do X. And I think we're going to see that, especially if folks are going to have any sort of interests in relevant standards too. It's just going to get really specific. Like we have general open data.
Yeah.
Now we realize that we really need all of these things to be consistent, or this is just like police data. We're going to have to get more serious about police data locally and federally, and here's how. And Congress has a lot of.
I think there's an interesting insight from that, and actually leads to my next question, which is for Debbie about mission, right? So it's one thing to be like, yeah, data is it's good, so open it. You know, like very broadly, we've had a lot of these policies, but increasingly we are getting, I totally agree, I see the same trend of moving towards something specific. You know, obviously your community is quite esoteric. I'm curious to know if you have any sort of anecdote or if anything stands out of a way that open data has helped, do you call it NREL?
NREL, yes.
NREL?
Yeah.
Accomplish its mission.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good examples there. One thing, just to follow up on what these guys were saying, so internally, from an agency standpoint, when these policies were released in the beginning, they were, in our mind, like there was no funding that went along with it, right? So it's like, you must release all your data, and there's no money to make that happen. So I think that was something that kind of put people off in the beginning. But now that we've been doing it for a while, people are putting, they have to now, put data management plans in their AOPs, which is the annual operating plan. And so now people are starting to plan for that, and they're starting to actually implement with the funding that they have. So before, we had no funding, and they said, you must do, and now we're at least seeing the future, and we're saying we do need to do it, so we need to put that in there just like we would a final report or something like that from some work. But there's a lot of good examples. We have the geothermal data repository is one of our DOE data repositories that we put out for the geothermal community, where DOE grantees are out there doing good work, and they have to supply their data back to us through this data repository. And because of that, people are getting access to data that they never had before. And so it's really helping to advance the geothermal world like it's never had before. And we've done the same kind of repository for the marine hydrokinetic world and for others. So we're starting to kind of cookie cutter these data repositories for all these different technology groups.
That's awesome. Go ahead, Joel.
No, I would just say one other thought in terms of, you know, the move towards specificity, and not all data, you know, should be necessarily has the same issues involved. And this, Jed, goes to your comment about shared data. I think one of the things that we're also going to be seeing is gradations of open, and you're seeing this particularly, I think, around medical data, the precision medicine initiative, the cancer moonshot. We're seeing some of these really huge initiatives now that are going to rely on being able to use a lot of patient data in some safe kind of way. And I think we may get to this sort of concept of a lot of things need to be semi-open or shared, you know, with appropriate constraints, but you know, not just open for anybody to use and access, even in an anonymized form, because anonymization is not perfect. So I think we may see sort of more sophisticated kind of gradations of open as we get into this, and more and that'll be part of the case-by-case approach as well.
Yeah.
I would push back from calling it a gradation of open. There's only one open.
Right. So yeah, that's oh man, this is great. I like this.
Internal sharing is good though.
Right.
Openish stage.
No.
So I just call it shared data. That's what we call it, shared. So that's like the umbrella term.
Right.
Because we don't want to be, so you know, my program's called the Open Data Program, but I also don't want to be dogmatic about it. So the way I measure whether we're doing good work or not is if we're making more data more available to more people. And so we've done actually, so last year quite significantly with the ICGC and TCGA, so the Cancer Genome Atlas and then International Cancer Genome Consortium, their data sets, which are privacy encumbered, but they're now available to credentialed researchers in the cloud. And so we've improved access to that data, but not made it open. Now, I've hogged all the questions. I have more questions for Aaron and stuff, but I actually want to open it up to the floor so I don't take up everybody's time. We've got like 9 minutes left. So if you have a question, please come up to the microphone there in the middle of the room so we can get it recorded. The room is just like buzzing with excitement, so I know there are lots of people out there with questions.
Hi, I guess my name is Thomas Grogan. I'm an economist, and I work with a lot of socioeconomic data. And one thing that I hadn't thought about till recently with respect to open data is the issue of anonymizing data sets when you're dealing with citizens and anything related to geographic information. You know, it can be easier than you realize to figure out who data is, especially if you're looking at like origin destination data with respect to transportation and anything like that. So just curious to hear what your thoughts are on all of that.
Anyone?
I'd say you're right. It is easier to kind of figure out that data than we think. So just taking off people's names or addresses doesn't really do it. If you bring it down to a census block, that may not be good enough. We have data scientists at NREL that are dealing with those issues now, and so we have the staff on hand that kind of help us anonymize data to the proper level. But yeah, it's a very good point that you can't just strip out one field and then make that data open necessarily. You do have to pay attention to that.
I would just offer up as a resource for each of these roundtables, we've prepared a briefing paper ahead of time. Those are all posted at opendataenterprise.org/convene. So if you take a look at this section on our privacy roundtable, which was the first one we've done, there's a briefing paper that deals with some of these issues, but I think more important, has a lot of citations that would enable you to go deeper if you're interested.
The only thing that I'll add is as we become more and more technically able, just like our sense of privacy is changing. People have talked about this, but a lot of the discussions I've had at the local level around different types of data set that include addresses, it's all over the place in terms of like where folks are like balancing what should be exposed and what shouldn't. So like registry of deeds information or voting information or other things like will include address, and you can of course, like if these are, if you scrape them or they're already available in a spreadsheet, like really like make connections very quickly. And you probably could have made those connections in the past. It would have just taken a little bit longer. So it's like layers of friction, and like what we as a society decide is correct in terms of like how much friction we feel comfortable with. But I think we're going to see a lot of specific privacy data laws as well. And that is something in terms of, like you said, address, like at the local level, it is just, it's all over the place.
All right, thanks for the discussion. To the young lady in the middle, does this data include titles and deeds and things of that nature? When you talk about big data, we have to go to the county clerk's office to get things, and not every clerk's office has a website in some regard. Is that what we're talking about when we talk about
That's
data?
what I just mentioned. So back when I was doing city planning stuff, I did a lot of housing work. So I did housing clerk stuff. So the bane of my existence was like the Hampden County Registry of Deeds website in Massachusetts, personally. But like I used to use it like for my job, for like a non-nefarious activity that I used all the time. And certainly like these nonprofits and like other things need this information. It's always been able you've been able to look it up and look it up online for some time. Usually you have to query for it. Sometimes they mask it in different ways. But yeah, that's the data set I was talking about.
And are the counties themselves against this push towards accessing their data?
It depends on the jurisdiction. And I mean, it's worth mentioning that some counties have open data policies too. So it's city, county, and state level. Usually the Registry of Deeds is like a whole other acting governance body, and it really depends. The argument there is more just like fields, and then like whether you query something versus you have a bulk download. And again, that's just like layers of friction. They're both accessible.
To what degree, though, do local jurisdictions rely on access to data for income? Because that was something that was actually brought up to us, was that if we were going to roll this down, we were going to take away folks' ability to raise money. So the access charges, so if you go to your registrar's office and say, yeah, give me $10 and I'll let you copy it, 10 cents a page after that.
I mean, again, it depends. Like an actual example of something that was paid for that is now free was a Pluto, is again a land use data set. What does it stand for? Property, land use, tax lot. Output. So New York City has this data set, and I forgot how many. I think they got like $20,000 a year or something from like this tax law data. But folks could also FOIA for it and pay less of a fee and get the information that way. But there was this big advocacy effort that was like, this should be open data. After they had their open data law, they're like, you have an open data law, but how come this data set isn't open? And that was still like a drop in the bucket for New York City in terms of income. So I think it depends. I mean, that's like a John Oliver episode about how much cities rely on like the tickets they give out, and then also how many GIS maps they sell. But I think consistently it's not as much as the tickets they give out.
I think, I mean, the most kind of egregious example of this that I've seen, and I last looked at this a couple years ago, so it may have changed by now. I'm not sure, but you know, state of Delaware has gotten millions of dollars by keeping its corporate registration data, you know, more closely held, or at least a lot of it, and this basically enables money laundering. So I think there are some cases where payment for data or keeping data behind a paywall or limiting access may be, you know, it can have different levels of impact, I think, and we may need to deal with it again in different ways in different situations.
Well, Aaron, I wanted to pick up on, you know, you're interested in the economic sort of impacts of opening data. You know, I talk about how, you know, open data allows our developers to do more things, and, you know, that creates activity in the economy. Was that a large motivator for, you know, your office's, work on the bill?
Absolutely. I mean, so for my boss, I mean, again, you know, somebody who worked in economic development, you know, his whole philosophy is, what do we do to get creative people to create jobs? And, you know, by creating, you know, an opportunity for folks to take advantage of something that they've paid for is the best way to do it. And so one of his best examples is, you know, somebody was looking at NOAA information and they like surfing, and they said, gee, you know, I could take information from weather buoys and I could create my own app, and now, you know, you could buy my app, and then all of a sudden now you have access to where you're going to get the best waves. And that actually happened. And so there are all kinds of different things that you could do. I mean, there's no limit to the creativity that you can have by going into the government and saying, hey, what do you have for me today? And, you know, getting a loan, employing people, you know, setting up shop, it's really good stuff.
Thanks. So the clock is telling us we're basically done, but if anybody has another question, we got one more. And if not, you can have 30 seconds of your day back to yourselves.
Happy to chat with anyone after.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, guys. That was fun. I thought that was really good. Yeah. Yeah.
It's in the same room, right?
Yeah, you can just say.
Yeah, no, it sounds good.